So I would like to welcome everyone to the day 2 of the COA TRC on vernacular architecture and traditional construction practices in Indian cities. And first of all, let me express my gratitude to the Council Architecture TRC for collaborating with APJ School of Architecture and Planning, Greater Noida, and allowing us to host the event. To start with today's session 1 of the day 2, we have with us Professor Manish Chalana from University of Washington. Dr. Manish Chalana has advanced degrees in architectural conservation, landscape architecture, and urban planning from India and US. He is currently an associate professor in the Department of Urban Design and Planning and the director of graduate certificate in historic preservation at the University of Washington. He is also the co-director of the Center for Preservation and Adaptive Reuse. He has published extensively in the academic journals on the topics of heritage conservation, as well as co-edited 2 books. He is also a member of South Asia program in the Jackson School of International Studies. Previously, he has taught as graduate student or lecturer at the University of Colorado and Pennsylvania State University and worked in India with INTAC and HUDCO. He consults on international projects mostly around historic preservation and is a founding director of the Center for Preservation and Adaptive Reuse, which strives to connect academia to practice of historic preservation. He has published on topics of urban design, planning history, and preservation in a variety of international journals. He co-edited the book Messy Urbanism, Understanding the Other Cities of Asia. Now, I would like to welcome Professor Manish Chalana to join us and impart his knowledge to all the attendees. I welcome you, sir.
All right. So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here and share with you what I know about this topic that I've titled Preservation and the Vernacular Environment. Let me just get to it. Let me grab my notes. So the title is Preservation and the Vernacular Environment. And since Gunjan has already introduced myself, I will not take up the time to do that. So here's the roadmap of what I'm going to be sharing with you today. Just wanted to have some sort of clarity. So, sorry. I thought I could make this thing work. No. Pen, okay. So I will start with the concept, and okay, my pen is not writing, but that's okay. I won't use it. Okay. So this is the roadmap for the talk. I will start with the concepts of both preservation and vernacular environment, because we're dealing with 2 things. We're dealing with 2 concepts here. So I'll start with that and sort of trace how we understand these concepts and how the field sort of addresses it. And then I'll go over the theoretical underpinnings of these 2 fields or concepts, whatever you want to call them. And then the third piece is I've tried distilling some lessons for the academy, because it's the nature of this is the nature of this event is such that a lot of you are in the academia. So I've tried pulling out some lessons for the academy and some lessons for practice on these 2 topics, and I think they both actually intersect. Lessons for practice and lessons for academia intersect. Then I'll end with reflections and Q&A. I'm hoping somebody is keeping track of time. So I'm told that I have 40 minutes. So if I exceed, please let me know. And
sure.
At the onset, I'm going to apologize to Anand Khatri that I have messed up his slides, because I just couldn't figure out these really, really large logos on a slide. They were so distracting that at one point I just thought I can't be working on slides that look like this. So I just started covering them. I'm sorry, my mind was not working. So apologies for that. So I start with the concept of vernacular, right? So vernacular, if you look at the definition of vernacular, it's both a noun and an adjective. It usually is broadly means from the region. So, for instance, the vernacular cuisine or vernacular uh, dresses or vernacular ways of construction and so on and so forth. So it's off the region, uh, but it comes to us from language. So largely, it comes to us from language, and when it came to an architecture, it is usually associated with the non-high styled architecture. So that's broadly how you can define it. So anything that is non-public, non-monumental, and non-high style is considered vernacular broadly. So it's mostly your domestic architecture. Uh, and then adjective also is the same that you can read. So this is how the concept is defined. Um, and what I'm trying to get to from this is broadly any piece of the built environment uh, in which uh, specialists or experts have no role to play, it would be considered uh, vernacular. And this could mean a building, it could mean landscape architecture, it could be an art object, it could be a structure, anything in which the role of an expert or a specialist cannot be seen, or they were not involved. What I show here to you is this classic work by Bernard Rudowski. I'm guessing some of you are already familiar with it. It's called Architecture Without Architects. So we all know there was architecture before architects came into the picture. And this book is titled Architecture Without Architects, a short introduction to non-pedigreed architecture. It came out of an exhibition that happened in the Museum of Modern Art in New York in the 1960s. And I think the exhibition was also of the same name. So the book that came out of the exhibition was published in 1964. And it sort of argued, more than argued, it demonstrated the artistic, functional, and cultural richness of vernacular architecture. So this is when really architects woke up to the idea of vernacular. We're talking about 1960s US, and 1960s US is sort of the space age US, and nobody's thinking about vernacular. Everybody's thinking about skyscrapers, especially the architects. They are thinking about modern architecture, urban renewal is in full swing, and if anything, vernacular is frowned upon. So this book comes out, and it introduces the reader to communal co-produced architecture, which is generated spontaneously, sometimes iteratively, based on common experiences and general understanding of the world, and also shared heritage of the people. So it's a good book. What you see here, there's a quote there that I put by Cressy, and he's talking about the same area that you see in this book, right? You cannot see any houses in the book, in the slide.
Slides not moving, Manish. Manish, sir, slides are not moving.
Which slide are you in?
Understanding the concepts vernacular.
Yeah, I'm still talking about that. Is that the slide you're seeing? You're seeing a slide that's
yes,
that shows yes. You are right.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so even though there is no house in sight, this land is doubly productive. Because the dwellings are below and the fields are upstairs, and the dwellings are, because they are below, they are free from vermin and very clean, and they're warm in the winter and cool in the summers, right? So everything is like this in this region in China. So this is how the exhibition was generally introducing people to the strengths and variations of vernacular architecture from around the world. And this was a very important piece of work, partly because it was featured in MoMA, which is a very grand venue in New York City. So this comes out, and people at that point begin to realize that vernacular is not just a product, but it's also a process. It's a way of doing and being. So this is a very important distinction. If you study vernacular, you don't necessarily just study brick and mortar. You study the processes and the intersectionality and the different sort of ideas of living, life, being that it brings together. So it can be a very complex study, and the whole field is defined as vernacular studies. In the interest of time, I'll keep moving on. So a vernacular architecture can be divided into traditional architecture and everyday architecture. And I've done that, and I'll it's not me who's doing it, scholars have done it, and it makes sense to me, and that's why I'm introducing it to you. So the traditional architecture, so I'm going to start with the traditional vernacular. Oftentimes, vernacular and traditional are used interchangeably. You probably have noticed in everyday speak, people use traditional and vernacular interchangeably, but I don't do that. Traditional, to me, is more folk architecture. It's a type of vernacular that is more pre-modern and largely associated with pre-modern societies in rural settings. And it's also off the region. So it's very sort of grounded and associated with the region. For example, the traditional architecture of Rajasthan is very different from the traditional architecture of Kerala, for instance, right? But the entire traditional architecture in Kerala, even with all the variations, have some similarities that would hold it together. Right? What you see here is a desert house in rural Rajasthan. It's made of mud with thatched roof, and is partially painted with chalk powder, right? And this is sort of the quintessential image of vernacular architecture when we think about vernacular. And here you see a peasant house in Ukraine. So these are the images that come to our mind when we think about vernacular. You know, I mean, I see this, and that's why I put it in the traditional category, because I often see these being romanticized in both academy and practice, and sometimes also fetishizing poverty. For instance, I'm thinking that why do these people have to maintain a thatched roof when it's so cumbersome and difficult to maintain? Why can't they just replace it with the tin roof, right? Traditions are not frozen in time. They change with time, and traditional architecture should also have that space to change with time. And I'll come to that because I think preservation makes it more complicated. The point I'm trying to make is continuity, use, and change are central to any vernacular environment. So think about it, continuity. If there's no continuity, there's no meaning in vernacular environment. If there's no use, there is no meaning because it becomes an artifact. And then if you don't allow it to change, which means grow, and if it's a family and your son gets married, you add another room. If you don't allow it to change, then that also impacts its sort of natural progression, if you will. So one more slide on the traditional vernacular or folk architecture, and here I'm showing you another classic work by Paul Murdoch. I think the title of this is Vernacular House Form in Ladakh. And the reason why I'm showing you this is that this is how vernacular environments began to be studied, right? So if you want to look at how vernacular environments are studied, this is a good work, and I think it's in the public domain, so you can find it, right? This work demonstrates how these places need to be understood. Like I said, they cannot just be understood as brick and mortar. There are multiple layers that inform you about a vernacular environment. And if you miss out on those, then you would have missed out on the very essence of this field of inquiry, right? So Paul Murdoch actually lays out the modes of documentation. He does ethnography, field ethnography, and then of course all types of studies around sectional studies and drawings and drafting, and also how people use spaces. So it's a good way to see how much depth you need to have to make a study on traditional architecture relevant or useful for others. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the second type, which is everyday, right? So everyday vernacular constitutes what is really the bulk of the built environment. Everything that is outside of monuments, as Paul Groth is saying, or high style design, everything else is everyday, right? So a lot of fabric is everyday, and everyday I'm using it broadly because it could be designed. Oftentimes it is self-built, not designed. Other times it is designed. It is also inspired by existing trends. It's usually in urban settings. It is a response to market forces. And Paul Groth, the same guy, has labeled it as marketplace vernacular. But like traditional vernacular, it's also very utilitarian and very functional. And aesthetics is a part of it, but it isn't the driver of it. So that is sort of broadly the distinction between folk architecture and everyday architecture, and they're both sort of in the realm of vernacular architecture. But the point is that both academia or academics, as well as the practice, has undervalued and underappreciated everyday places. You can say it's the curse of the ordinary, right? Because there's so many that you really try to look for the extraordinary in the ordinary, right? Because there's so many that you want to find one that really stands out. Maybe it's this one. So you're looking for the extraordinary examples in the ordinary, which is all right, but it could also be problematic if you're just looking for extraordinary in the ordinary category. So now I'm going to move to, I've discussed with you the concept of vernacular. I'm going to move to the concept of historic preservation. So historic preservation broadly is, I have a definition here from Wikipedia, the one in blue that you can read. It essentially says that it's an endeavor that seeks to preserve and protect buildings, objects, landscapes that are of historical significance, right? And I have a problem with that definition. So this is my definition in red. I think it's not as simple as the Wikipedia definition makes it, right? Because history is complex, and the mandate of historic preservation is laden with social responsibilities. Because it is the role of preservationists to interpret and maintain the histories and memories and places of all groups of populations, right? And it's easier said than done. It's a very challenging task, as you can see. The case of the Confederate monuments in the US, as well as the Babri Masjid in India. People are willing to kill and die for historic sites, right? Because they convey heavy meaning and they can be interpreted in different ways. So preservation is not as simple as it is made out to be. So conservation is a serious business, right? And it needs to be more responsible and inclusive. But much of the effort of practice is focused on, again, the high style, the high and the mighty in the landscape, and at the cost of vernacular environments, because we're talking about vernacular, right? And then if you're only preserving the high and the mighty in the landscape, then you're also presenting a very contrived sense of history, right? Because you cannot interpret history from just grand places, because the elites may have a lot of power, but they are in the minority. So historic preservation also, has a lot of biases in the way it sees the past or chooses to maintain the past or interpret the past. It's mostly preserving sites and memories of elite groups. Women are mostly absent from the archives and historic preservation, and their histories are often trivialized and neglected. Sultan Razia's tomb, you can see in Delhi. It's such a, she's the empress of India, uh, you know, and you can see the state of her tomb. Then historic preservation also does not, care about Dalit history, with the exception of Ambedkar's childhood home in Mumbai, which is also just a municipal designation, is not fully protected. It doesn't care about working class histories. It doesn't care about low caste histories, low class history, low caste history. Doesn't care about third gender, the Hijra's histories. I mean, with women, there's an exception of Rani Jhansi, the nationalist queen, Rani Jhansi, and her palace in Jhansi is preserved. But other than that, it's mostly the history of the Rajas and the Maharajas and some elite praja that would live in fine grand Havelis. So that you can see how skewed and how narrow that perspective is of historic preservation. And of course, the bulk of the environment, which is vernacular, which is laden with meaning, and of course memories, we don't care about it. And I'm not suggesting that you should go and preserve every piece of it, but I'm suggesting that you have to think about what are some of the meaningful ways in which you can preserve histories of through the vernacular environments. So one of the blows to historical everyday vernacular environment in the US and also India, I think, is in the post-World War II decades. It's everywhere in the world. So by the early 20th century, architects and planners have taken full control of the built environment, right? They've professionalized the fields. Planning as a discipline is already established. Architecture has also already reformed from a trade school, trade discipline to a professional discipline and a university degree program. And they took imagining and building not just the cities, but even their own homes out of the hands of the people, right? They said, no, you cannot design your own home. And they did that by introducing elaborate permitting processes and signatures of architect, and like AIA in the US, you had to have signatures of architects. So they professionalized the disciplines. And partly it was needed at that time because, modernism brought with it a lot of new technology. Steel technology, especially, which needed expertise, structural engineering, and calculations and curtain windows and so on and so forth. So it needed that, but the homes could have still be able to design. People should have been able to design their own homes, but in the Western context, they were not allowed to. And modernism had really brutal consequences for the everyday vernacular. What you see here is Denver, Colorado in 1960s. And all these city blocks in orange, which look like this. You can see, sorry, I can't zoom, which had, mid-density, high-density mid-rise structures. And you can see here very well made building. They're all destroyed to create modern, high-rise buildings, open spaces. The model that Le Corbusier gave us, the tower in the park model, something like this, right? The tower in the park model and the minimal dwelling, and he was just freeing up the ground plane, and putting the buildings on pilates so that there was circulation and air and light. But it wasn't as successful as we know. The promise of modernism was not met. It wasn't just an architecture style. It came. It brought with it a lot of promise of a different way of living and a different way of being, but it couldn't deliver all of that. So modernism was a big blow on the everyday vernacular, which is mostly in the urban settings. Let me just quickly go over the theoretical underpinnings of vernacular. So how did vernacular, the idea of vernacular arrive in design, planning, and conservation disciplines? It came to us via geography, specifically cultural geography. And there's a lot of literature in it, and I can't get into this. But there's a guy, there was a guy called Carl Sawyer out of Berkeley, University of California in Berkeley. He's a cultural geographer, and he essentially defined the concept of cultural landscapes. So all his students and colleagues furthered his work. So essentially, they were studying and defining vernacular environments for us, right? They were studying its components, its methodologies, looking at the connection between nature and culture, how the natural setting shapes the vernacular fabric. I mean, it is critiqued for being too environmental deterministic, because it gives a lot of credit to nature and not as much to culture, because it says that nature, the cultures respond to what the natural environment is, and that is true. But the environmental deterministic models are do not always hold, because cultures are also very powerful, and they have wonderful ways of shaping what they want to build on the landscape. So, for instance, the early cultural geographers would study, for example, barns across America. So they would study how different European groups that migrated from Europe to the United States shaped the barns, based on the natural setting, but also cultural understanding that they brought with them from their mother country, right? So there's a lot of studies there, and I'm if you're interested, I have read J.B. Jackson a lot, discovering the vernacular landscape. Um, so there are lots of names here if you want. Still Goes Outside Lies Magic is amazing, because all these people are just saying that there's a lot of interesting, valuable stuff in places that we don't even see. And they're saying we're like fish in the water, that they don't see the water, right? Because we're always looking for the grand and the beautiful in the landscape. So they're like J.B. Jackson says, there's no such thing as a dull landscape, right? And this is a good book which has all, David Lowenthal is one of them, Mining is another one. Yves Vuitton gave us the concept of topophilia, which is place attachment and love for places. So all these people are sort of, the gurus of vernacular. So eventually vernacular studies became even more complex. So first they were looking at the brick and mortar and the social fabric and how they intersected, how culture and nature collectively shaped the environment. But later, the second generation of cultural geographers who like to be recognized as critical cultural geographers, and in that they are the likes of Del Upton and Paul Groth and others, they started using lenses of race, gender, class, sexuality, and such in understanding vernacular spaces. So I'm not going to get into that. There's a whole body of literature in that. So that is broadly the theoretical underpinning. The theoretical underpinning of preservation, again, for the interest of time, I'm just going to give you a sort of a bird's eye view of it. So there are two broad movements in preservation, the scrape versus the anti-scrape. So scrape is a movement that, a preservation philosophy that doesn't, fuss too much about the historic fabric. It's like, they take liberty in rebuilding it and reimagining it to fit the building to its contemporary time. And the proponent of the scrape ideology or philosophy is Viola Leduc. He's very well known for the restoration of Notre Dame in Paris. So if you think Notre Dame is original, no, Viola Leduc, when he restored Notre Dame in the late 19th century, he just did what he felt like doing. He added statues that were not there. He put something there. In fact, in one of the statues, he even placed himself. He has his own statue somewhere up there in the cathedral. So that is sort of understood as the scrape school. And then the anti-scrape school is like, what we follow in India, which is, you don't even restore a building, because restoration itself is the biggest destruction a building can suffer, right? Because you cannot recall the spirit of the dead craftsmen and have them redo it. So Ruskin is a proponent of that, and he says it's a lie from beginning to the end. So they say, like, and this is where the idea of the English ruins came in, because they're all English, and they didn't want to do anything with ruins. They just wanted buildings to die their natural death and didn't want to do anything. So India mostly follows this anti-scrape, but it does believe in consolidation and stabilization of monuments. And now it's moving more towards it, but it's not going in this direction. So based on that, since India is mostly anti-scrape school, its framing of preservation is such that vernacular environments are bound to fail in being recognized or preserved or whatever, right? Because change in the vernacular building is central. Vernacular buildings get their meaning from use. Can you imagine if a farmhouse is not being used as a farmhouse? It loses a lot of meaning. Yes, you can have a rest house there, but it completely severs the connection between the farm and the house. So there's a discontinuity in the way the anti-scrape works and in the way vernacular functions, right? So there's a disconnect between vernacular application and preservation sort of framing in the Indian context. So there are a lot of struggles in it, but I wanted to show you a few works from my edited volume, in which we have many pieces on vernacular if you're interested in it. Yamini Mumbai pieces on crafts as intangible heritage, in which she looks at Jandiala paint. There is a piece by Sakriti and I, and we're looking at, Chamba and its vernacular environment. So there's a lot of theoretical advancement in trying to understand vernacular environments in the Indian context. So there's hope for the future. So do all that I've talked with you so far, I want to sort of just pause and see, do we have relevance of those theoretical underpinnings and those conceptual understandings for India, right? Because all of these have come to us from a different world, a Western world, which have, different ways of knowing and learning and understanding things. So far I've just glossed over the theoretical underpinnings and conceptual framings of these concepts of preservation and vernacular. And there's a lot of information there if you are interested in these topics. So the question is, does vernacular have similar relevance in India as in Europe and or US? I think it does, because we are at a point, there's a lot of growth and development in the country. It wants to be a strong economy. It's in a competitive mode and a growth mode. What US was in the 1940s and 1950s, right? So it's not really thinking about places like this. These are just disposable places, and it's more thinking about, a global image, sort of a shiny, more corporate urbanism, if you will, right? So there is a potential of lot of damage to vernacular environments. Varanasi, the Kashi Vishwanath temple is a major example that's happening in front of your eyes. There's a lot of places. I've studied Girgaon in Mumbai, which is being transformed from a mill sort of, township, cotton mill township, to these the places of global capital and high modern architecture, right? And I'll get to it. So one could argue, what is the problem? right? And again, I'm not saying that all the milk complexes need to be saved. I'm saying that, if you want to interpret the history of development from your context, you need places in a meaningful way, not just one site here and one site here, in some sort of meaningful way where the new and the old are integrated in ways that they are talking to each other and embracing each other and communicating with each other. So I think there's a relevance for India, and I hope you'd agree. So now I'm moving to the third phase. So what is the lessons for us here, right? So I tried distilling some lessons for the academy because many of you are professors. Uh, I found this William Curtis's argument on postmodern classicists, right? Which he's saying that far from reinterpreting history effectively, as they claim, they're just capturing the outward appearance. So it's pastiche, not the principle. And you see a lot of that happening in urban areas where you walk into a bar and it looks like a rural hamlet. So there's a lot of pastiche, flimsy, well, one could say playful way in which vernacular is being used in to either hearken a different time and place, or just sort of engage vernacular in the urban context. But I would say that your responsibility as educators is to educate your students about the value of vernacular, and not just as a product, brick and mortar, but also as a process, right? And engage in its complex intersectionality with cultures, cultural understanding, and place attachments, and so many other things that vernacular scholars deal with, right? Only then they would develop an appreciation for it. I remember out of architecture school, I had no idea of vernacular because my entire time was trying to build something in the 1990s that I didn't even see happening around me. We had books that were, published in the West, and we were like making drawings of curtain walls when I didn't see any curtain walls in my context. So this is the irony of pedagogy. We were never engaged in the concepts of vernacular. I had to teach myself all this, what I'm sharing with you, read to understand it. So just as you do with contemporary architecture, you should try to integrate it in the curriculum, right? And also sort of engage with them what not to do, and then also piece the vernacular with other themes that emerge in architecture and planning and related disciplines. And I'll get to that when I come to lessons for practice, because I think lessons for practice overlap with lessons for academy, because architecture is a professional discipline, right? So I think the lesson for practice is that instead of shying away from vernacular, the new breed of architects and planners need to be comfortable with it and need to embrace it, right? Because there's a lot of, you're not just embracing it because it's a pretty little thing. No, that's not the argument. You're embracing it because it already has good density in it, right? It's often well built, and so it aligns with the principles of sustainability, and hence it's good for the climate, right? And it maintains diversity in the built fabric. So there are lots of different arguments that you can use to argue for the appreciation of the everyday vernacular or the traditional vernacular, right? And then also link, I would hope that you're making your students more socially responsible. You should also link, there's also a lesson for practice, but also academy. You should link vernacular to equity and inclusion. So we're not just crying about these ratty old buildings. We are we're saying that these buildings are important to maintain because it's good for creating an equitable city, and there's research there, right? And I'm just going to show you one example. What you see here is again a work of Paul Groth, the critical cultural geographer that I mentioned earlier. He studies single room occupancy hotels in San Francisco, and they were everywhere in US cities. Essentially, single room occupancy hotels were, you could just rent one room and had to use a shared bathroom. So there are lots of different kinds of single room occupancy hotels in cities like Seattle, San Francisco, and elsewhere. So it gave urban dwellers, options of housing, right? But because they were like, the cities didn't think they were of any value, they tore them all down and replaced them with modern towers, which was fine. Modern towers probably brought in more density, but then they took away affordability, because those apartments rent for a lot and they offer you for a minimum of 2 bedrooms, right? And this one just offers you just one little room and you don't even have a kitchen. You go down and eat in the diners on the street. So the streets are also very lively because you're always out in the streets. You're meeting friends in the streets because you can't invite anybody in your room. So fast forward now, there's a major crisis of affordability in San Francisco and Seattle because we've created such an inequitable city that if you step out, there are people in tents everywhere. They're just camping in parks. They're camping, living in tents on the streets because we've sort of erased these everyday vernacular spaces that provided people, an opportunity to basic living. Maybe it wasn't grand or anything to Facebook about, but it was still better than being on the streets. So that's one lesson. Another lesson, again, these are, I think, these are not just for practice. These are, I think, the lessons overlap. So the other lesson that I think is that you need to teach your students to contemporize vernacular, right? And a lot of modernists have done it. Reval did it. Korea's done it. Doshi's done it. So the example here, what you're seeing in Belapur, this is Korea's experimented with contemporary vernacular, right? Which he defines as self-conscious commitment to uncover a particular tradition's response to place and climate, and thereafter to exteriorize these formal and symbolic identities into a creative new form through the eye of the architect or the artist, who's in touch with the contemporary realities. That is very powerful. They're just saying that, you need to think about the place, climate, the cultural traditions, and then use those through the filter of your creative, architect's eye and create realities that have lasting human values, right? And so in so doing, he provided the example of Belapur, right? Belapur had density, achieved density in its low-lying form. It achieved densities of 500 to 650 persons per acre, which is very high, very, very high. And Doshi did the same for Aranya. And of course, these examples have also been criticized, and I don't have to get into that, but just, so your students should know about these. How do you contemporize vernacular in meaningful ways, not pastiche, And then the same, another example, which is wonderful, which didn't happen, is Revati Kamat's proposal for Anantgram. And you probably know Revati is not with us anymore. She's an amazing, brilliant architect. And I communicated with her on this project because I was going to write something about her before she died. And the way she explained it, it's incredible how committed she was in understanding how these villagers, the understanding of spaces could then be integrated in the contemporary form. right? So you can see, so Gav ki yaadein. So of course, they're bringing memories of the village to the city. And this is a Katputli, for those of you who don't know, was a slum in New Delhi. And these were mostly migrants from Rajasthan. And so they'd all come here and they were sort of creating spaces based on their understanding of how one should live. And they cooked outside on chulas and other things. So Revati helped the villagers gave her the measurements using their arms, for her to create spaces, clusters like this. And those clusters became the site plan, right? But of course, it was rejected because that means the entire site would have gone back to the slum dwellers. And DDA did not want to do that. So DDA instead later sold the parcel to Raheja for a pittance, and Raheja is creating this, voila, and in any of the renderings, you don't even, and they're providing slum housing for the slum dwellers, which look like this, right? It's in situ. It's the first in situ slum redevelopment project in Delhi. Now, this is it's a slap in the face of equity and inclusion. If DDA has to give its land away, I get it that it was encroached land. Why would it give it to a developer, right? Yes, developers were settling the slum dwellers, but they were first of all not even settling all the slum dwellers. And look at what they've created for them. Do you think that people who live like this can reorganize their lives in vertical spaces like that? I mean, where are they going to cook? How are they going to make their Katputlis, and so on and so forth? So this is the link. This is how you can sort of convince your students to think about, that we're not just talking about environments that look like this because they're pretty, but we're talking about these because they have social consequences and a lot more, riding on them than just the form. So for reflections, I think I'll just take questions and we can figure it out together. So thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. And I'm happy to take any questions, thoughts, whatever you have.
Hi, Manish. It's all